More than 500 starving prisoners were trapped nearly 30 miles behind enemy lines. Many had already survived one of the worst atrocities of the entire war, and American commanders feared they were running out of time. This is the story of a rescue mission so dangerous, the men who volunteered for it were told, flat out, that they might not come back. It was January 1945 in the Philippines. Only weeks earlier, Japanese troops had forced 150 American prisoners of war at a camp called Palawan into trenches and air raid shelters and set them on fire. Men who tried to escape the flames were shot or bayoneted. Only 11 survived. 139 were murdered. When American intelligence discovered that a similar camp at Cabanatuan held over 500 men, commanders feared those prisoners could be executed before the advancing army ever reached them. The men inside Cabanatuan had already endured nearly 3 years of starvation, disease, forced labor, and brutal beatings. Many had survived the Bataan Death March itself, one of the most horrific events of the Pacific War. Some were so weak they could barely stand on their own, so a small force was assembled. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci selected roughly 120 Army Rangers, 2 teams of Alamo Scouts, medics, and radio operators. The assault force itself was small A, but hundreds of Filipino guerrillas would guide them, gather intelligence, and block any Japanese reinforcements along the way. They marched more than 20 miles through Japanese-held ground. Rivers, open rice paddies, roads being used by retreating enemy tanks. If they were spotted before reaching that camp, this lightly armed raiding party could easily be trapped, deep behind enemy lines, with almost nowhere to run. And it very nearly did go wrong before it even started. Filipino guerrilla captain Juan Pajota warned Mucci that large Japanese formations were moving right past the camp, and that attacking that night would be suicide. Mucci listened. He postponed the entire raid 24 hours at enormous risk because he trusted a guerrilla leader's instincts over his own timeline. Local Filipino villagers played their own dangerous part. They guided the Americans. They gathered food. And in one of the smallest but most crucial details of the entire operation, they quietly tied up or muzzled their own dogs, so barking animals wouldn't give away over 100 armed men creeping through their villages in the dark. 2 Alamo Scouts disguised themselves as Filipino farmers. Wearing straw hats, they moved through the fields examining crops, while one walked stooped over with a convincing limp and spent an entire day hiding in a shack just a few hundred yards from the camp's front gate, sketching every detail while Japanese guards walked past them without a second glance. Guard towers, barracks, telephone lines, every possible escape route. They needed to know it all before a single shot was fired. For the final approach, there was almost no cover left. The Rangers had to crawl, on their stomachs, across an open field for over an hour, while Japanese sentries watched from towers just above them. At one point, a guard seemed to notice movement in the grass, and then simply lowered his rifle and looked away. Above them, a P-61 Black Widow night fighter, nicknamed Hard to Get, began flying low, repeatedly cutting one of its engines and letting it backfire, again and again, making it sound like the plane was about to crash. Every Japanese eye in that camp turned upward to the sky, and while they stared, the Rangers crawled the final stretch into position, completely unseen. At 7:45 that evening, one single rifle shot rang out. That was the signal. Every assault team attacked at once. The guard towers, the pillboxes, every defended position around that camp were neutralized in roughly 30 seconds. A sergeant named Theodore Richardson sprinted across open ground and blasted the lock off the main gate with his pistol, and the Rangers stormed straight into the compound. Inside, the fighting lasted barely 12 minutes, but here's the part almost nobody expects. When the gunfire started, many of the prisoners didn't celebrate. They panicked. After 3 years of abuse, some genuinely believed their guards had finally come to execute them. Even after American soldiers were standing right in front of them, some men refused to leave their huts, certain it had to be some kind of trap. Meanwhile, outside the camp, Filipino guerrillas under Captain Pajota were fighting a battle of their own. They'd already blown a hole in a nearby bridge, and they held that position against an entire Japanese battalion, using machine guns, landmines, and bazookas to stop Japanese soldiers and armored vehicles from ever reaching the camp. Getting into Cabanatuan had been hard. Getting out proved even harder. The planners had underestimated just how weak these men truly were. Rangers ended up carrying prisoners on their backs. They loaded dozens onto carts pulled by water buffalo, provided on the spot by local villagers. The evacuation column eventually stretched into 71 carts, spanning well over a mile. One British prisoner, seriously ill and partly deaf, had hidden inside a latrine when the shooting began. He remained there as the rescue column departed, unaware that he had been left behind. Fortunately, an Alamo Scout team had stayed near the camp to make one final check. With help from Filipino guerrillas, they found him and brought him to safety. The cost was almost unbelievably small. Only 2 American Rangers were killed in the entire operation. And in the end, more than 500 prisoners, men who had been starved, tortured, and marched to the edge of death, walked and rode out of that camp free. It remains one of the most successful prisoner of war rescue missions in American military history. 10 of the Rangers and 2 of the Alamo Scouts were later brought to the White House to meet President Franklin Roosevelt personally because of what they did that night. Roughly 120 Rangers, 2 teams of Alamo Scouts, hundreds of Filipino guerrillas. Together, they didn't just complete a mission, they walked more than 500 men out of hell.